Tack ska ni ha. So, first I would like to say thank you to Borgen, who introduced the meeting in such a wonderful way. Borgen is one of Sweden's oldest student orchestras. And then I will continue with saying welcome to Lund and welcome to the World Economic History Congress. First, I would like to give the floor to Liliane Perez, who is the president of the International Economic History Association. Welcome, Liliane.
Thank you so much, Mats. And I'm very, very glad to be here. And I would say from Paris to Lund, it's such a pleasure to see our community, our scientific community, gather again. It's so important to be able to gather, to be united as a scientific community in these times, which are very troubled. It's such important. I think it's really the mission of our International Economic History Association to be able to meet, to work, to collaborate, to dialogue. It's our mission. So thank you so much to be here with all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Liliane, and it's an honor to take over from Paris, where the Congress was the last time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We live in a time when sometimes you think it's outright stupidity has become a political badge of honor, and contempt of science has become a virtue for governments in several countries. Therefore, it feels extra valuable that we gather for this type of conference. Here, the latest research findings will be presented and discussed. Here, we will take new steps forward to understand our past and our present, and thus also something of our future. We will never let governments or populist movements influence our research and its direction. The Academy is free and shall remain so. And with that, I declare the 20th World Economic History Congress officially open. We have some really exciting and intense days ahead of us. Immediately after this opening, Elise van Meerkerk will give the first keynote of the Congress. Tonight at 6 o'clock, Cesar Hidalgo will give the second, and on Wednesday evening, Mar Rubio Varas will give the closing keynote. I will soon go through a little bit more of the program and provide some practical information. But first, before that, I would like to introduce Stig Svensson, who is the Deputy Mayor of the city of Lund. They are one of our funders. Thank you for that, Stig, who made this event possible. You are most welcome, Stig.
Thank you. We are very honored to have you as our guests. Because previously you have been in Paris, 2 million inhabitants, Boston, 600,000 inhabitants, and Kyoto, 1.5 million. And now here in Lund, 100,000. But during July and August, we are only 70,000. Because all the university students have traveled home. So the streets, pubs, restaurants and so on is for you. And it's very large. The largest congress I've been to was 500 persons, but you are to be 1,200. That's very big, I must say. Your main theme is equality, sustainable challenges. 25 years ago, Lund City Council decided to work systematically with our environment and our climate footprint. We would become leaders in Sweden in building a climate-friendly society. Today, in our municipal operations, we are to more than 99% fossil-free. All heatings of schools, offices and other premises is fossil-free. The energy for street lighting, municipalities' cars is fossil-free. Almost everything in our operations is fossil-free. North of the city, out in the fields and meadows, 6 kilometers from here, we have 2 world-leading laboratories. MAX 4 is a laboratory for accelerator physics with the world's most powerful synchrotron light facility. And we have the ESS, European Spallation Source, fully completed within 2 years. And then we'll have the world's most powerful neutron source. Between the city here and up to these facilities, we are building a new district for 15,000 inhabitants. We want these inhabitants to travel by public transport or by bicycle. 5.5 years ago, we therefore inaugurated Sweden's first new tram line in 110 years. It runs from the central station and up to the European Spallation Source. We built it so that the researchers and the inhabitants can travel fast and cheap with public transport instead of using cars. I recommend a travel by this tram line. You can't go wrong, it only goes one. You will pass through new built housing. And they have one of the newly built apartment buildings, a conditioning for moving in is that no one in the family owns a car. It's not a decision from the city council, but they are testing. This new district has become a testbed for almost everything to make it more livable. For instance, these 2 laboratories, it's a tremendous amount of energy used. Almost everything, there is excess heat. This heat we are using to the entire district to heat the facilities, the housing, and at the moment we have the world's largest low temperature heating facility because of this. And we are a climate leader in Sweden for climate smart society. We can state that the city center, despite a sharp increase in population, car traffic has decreased with 35% in 10 years. And the proportion of people using bicycle is up to 30% at the moment. 25 years ago, we set 35 goals to be achieved by 2030. We will not succeed with them all. Some of the goals are not entirely in our own hands. Some is for the Parliament to decide. But a very sad fact is, even if we had succeeded, it wouldn't be enough. But we must keep on struggling to get a better society. But we also have goals for social sustainability. 8 years ago, we got a letter from one of the institutions at the university. They asked us, please declare Lund as a human rights city, the first in Sweden. And so we did. And the university also said that they would help us to work systematically and comprehensively in all municipal activities with this. It has been a great help for us. You have the right to be safe. You are in one of Sweden's safest cities. Criminal activities has decreased with 35%, with 20% for the late 10 years. But still, young females don't dare to take the bus alone in late evenings, so there is much more to do. You have the right to education. Our children attend schools with almost extremely good results. But children with parents who have no or very low education, they get extra support, but not to the extent needed. And the same applies for children with neuropsychiatric disabilities, for instance, autism. Working with sustainability has taught us one thing. You need money. A lot of money. Because if you don't have money, you can do nothing. So if you move to Lund, high taxes will be taken out for you. And there is a lot of whining about it. But the communities around us, they have lower taxes, but there is a lot of whining there too. And a strictly personal point of view, that thing with low taxes, it's overhyped, especially among the rich. And many politicians say we must have lower taxes. Yeah, okay. How? There are too many bureaucrats and managers. Easy to say. Point them out to me, and we will agree. No, they are saying it without knowing what they are talking about. The risk of over-bureaucratization is significant in all big business, private, municipalities, state agencies. You must observe and look. But it is not a problem you can address through sweeping populist statements. Once again, a very warm welcome to the city of Lund. Take a stroll in our beautiful and quiet city, at least now when 30,000 students is out of town. And later this week, if you see an umbrella, grab it, you may need it.
So thank you very much, Stig, for this warm welcome to the city of Lund. Now I'm quickly going through some practical things. As you are well aware of, the conference core activity is, as usual, parallel sessions. At this conference we will have 19 parallel sessions where approximately 1,000 papers will be presented Monday to Thursday. And Igor Martins has been struggling for a long time to put this puzzle together. It will take some time for you to learn how to find your way around these old and slightly confusing buildings we are in. Here in Borgen, in Palestra, which is over there, where you come in to on the north side of the park, the main university building, that's the White House, on the other side of the fountain, and at Kulturen, right next to the pavilion. If you don't find your way, ask our volunteers. During the breaks, coffee, tea, and refreshments will be served in the pavilion and inside the Tegnérs restaurant, which is to the left of the main entrance. If you go into the main entrance, it is to the left, so to say, so it's in the building. They were not open when you came, so you hardly recognize it. Special diets will be exclusively served in Tegnérs, and you can see on your badge what lunches you have pre-ordered. It says something like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on. And if it says Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, then you have pre-ordered lunch every day. And then there is a sign with a music sign and a glass, which shows that you have pre-ordered food at the mingles. And we will have 2 mingles, 2 receptions, tonight and Wednesday evening. Food will be served, but only for those who have pre-ordered. But the bars and the mingling are, of course, open to all conference participants. Tonight at 8 o'clock, the Carling Sisters will start playing jazz in the pavilion. On Wednesday evening, after Mar Rubio Vara's keynote, prizes for the best doctoral thesis since the last World Congress in Paris will be awarded. The shortlisted thesis, 9 in total, will be presented today on this stage. And I know that the assessment groups have had a really hard work with this. There have been so much excellent research done and produced by our youngest researchers the last 3 years. And prizes for best poster will also be awarded. The poster exhibition will take place in Athens, the room directly under us, beyond the registration desk, so to say. That's also the way you find your way out to the pavilion. if you don't want to go outside, but you can go through there. The General Assembly of the International Economic History Association will meet in this very room tomorrow after the last parallel session. That will be 5:45. I also want to take the opportunity to promote some of our cultural events. We have city walks with fantastic guides on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. We have a guided tour of the Skissernas Museum, the Museum of Sketches collections, on Thursday evening. On Friday morning, you have the opportunity to become an archaeologist for one day when we help excavate Uppeåkra, Lund's predecessor and one of Scandinavia's most important Iron Age and Viking Age settlements. The number of places for these activities are limited, and you can register with the app or on the website. But no advance booking is required for tomorrow's karaoke evening, taking place down in Tingnes. It's hosted by Jonas Helgers from the department in Lund. And if he can sing, everybody can sing. No, just joking. He sings wonderful. Registration is free with the app or website also for the Economic History Fun Run on Friday afternoon. That will be the last thing that happens on this Congress. And that is hosted by Jonathan Yates from our department as well. Now I will not continue to overload you with information. If anything is unclear, please contact the volunteers or other staff. Instead, I would like to give the word to Faustine Perrin, who will present the first keynote of the Congress. You are welcome, Faustine.
Thank you, Mats. So it's my pleasure to introduce the first keynote speaker of this World Economic History Congress 2025, Professor Elise van Nederveen Meerkerk. So Elise is a professor in Economic and Social History at Utrecht University. She's also honorary research fellow at the International Institute of Social History. And she has published in various prominent journals in social history, in economic history, as well as in gender studies. So her research stands out not only for the contribution she has made to gender in economic history, but also for the intersectional approach that she uses in her work. She has led a prestigious ERC Consolidator grant, Race to the Bottom, for which she conducted comparative research and also investigated how households' decisions regarding labor and consumption influenced macroeconomic shifts in global textile production over 2 centuries. Elise's research ranges from the histories of textile worker, child labor, domestic workers, sex workers, and she also integrates in her work this comparative approach where she looks at European regions, but as well colonial territories. In 2019, she published a book, Women, Work, Colonialism in the Netherlands and Java, which revealed important deep structural inequalities, economic and gender inequalities. Her work also investigates the agency of households and especially women's contributions and children's contribution to changing labor systems. And overall, she has contributed through her work to improve our understanding of labor allocations and household strategies and how they influence and were influenced by industrial development and decline over time. She's currently working on developing a new project on coerced labor in the Dutch Empire. And in today's keynote, Elise will guide us through a rethinking of political economy and connecting gender, labor, class, and race, and showing how these dynamics are actually foundational to understanding global economic transformations. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Elise van Nederveen Meerkerk. Did you share it? Did you share your slides with me?
Yes, I did. They're up, so
Okay.
I don't know.
Perfect.
How can I switch them?
So maybe
This one?
proper.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent.
Well, thank you very much, Faustine. Oh, I can't go back, apparently. Thank you for this kind introduction and also for inviting me. It's a great honor to speak to you all and to open this lovely conference. In world politics today, hypermasculinity has taken center stage, especially in authoritarian right-wing regimes. World leaders such as Trump, Putin, Erdogan, Netanyahu and Modi tend to portray their ideal nation states as inhabited by strong, heterosexual men and obedient women, who preferably come from dominant ethnic groups. In countries ranging from Russia to the United States, we witness how women's, migrants, and other minorities' rights are being curtailed, sometimes at a startling speed. Many of these measures are related to care and reproduction. All over the world today, we see how women's reproductive freedoms are being constrained in a wave of illiberalism with religion as superglue. Think, for instance, of Trump's enthusiastic support for the pro-life movement, even at the cost of pregnant women's lives. As you can see here, on one of his fact sheets, the president claims that this is supported by an overwhelming majority of taxpayers. They are unwilling to pay for abortions. And doesn't seem to work. Can somebody? Yes, thank you. I have a lot of clicks, so I prefer to do it myself. And over the past months, the raids performed by the ICE have made the position of hundreds of thousands undocumented domestic workers even more precarious than it already was. It is those workers, defined by gender, class, and color, who, both literally and figuratively, do the dirty laundry of middle-class, often white citizens. Care is thus a highly political issue, as care work and caregiving tasks are often implied to be performed by women, especially, but not exclusively, in traditional gendered conceptions of what society should look like. Within most heterosexual relationships, women still spend much more time on domestic and caregiving tasks than men. The disparity differs greatly between world regions, as you can see in this graph. But everywhere in the world, women consistently spend more time on unpaid caregiving, with a global average of 2.6 hours per day more than men. Care is also of great economic importance. Time investment in the upbringing of children allows them to become functional citizens with a suitcase full of human, social, and emotional capital. At the other end of the age spectrum, the population is getting older worldwide. Government expenditure on healthcare alone is massive and has considerably risen in many countries over the past 20 years. Many scholars and politicians even speak of a crisis of care, with increasing demand for by both the elderly and by double-income families, while care workers are harder and harder to find. What is more, under neoliberalization,
The care sector in its broadest sense has become a cash cow for many private businesses, most predominantly in the United States, but also elsewhere in the world. While care tasks have thus been absorbed in the capitalist system, the actual people doing the work are usually undervalued. Paradoxically, middle-class women have over the past decades increasingly built careers by outsourcing care within the household to cheap domestic workers and caregiving workers from the global south. And middle-class families enjoy more leisure time. All of this increases GDP with production as well as consumption. Take the example of Singapore in 2018, with a population of about 6 million people, where at least 250,000 domestic workers were employed. Together, the direct contributions by domestic workers to Singapore's GDP were $8 billion, more than 2% of GDP. Additionally, as the great majority of these domestic workers were migrants, they remitted almost $1 billion to their home countries. Some of these countries, such as the Philippines and Myanmar, can hardly survive economically without these remittances. As these examples make abundantly clear, care work, paid as well as unpaid, is not only highly gendered, but also racialized. In many countries, care workers are not only women, but specifically migrant women, or women with a different ethnicity than their employers. This raises the issue of intersectionality, an academic concept that I will explain in a moment, but which in short boils down to the fact that everybody is defined by a multiplicity of intersecting characteristics, such as gender, ethnicity, class, and sexual orientation. For care workers, their status as women and migrants and of lower economic class often exposes them to multiple forms of exploitation. This was, for instance, visible in Lebanon in the fall of 2024, when middle-class families fled from Israeli bombs, but demanded that their domestic workers from Africa stayed locked inside to look after their houses. Altogether, this equation highlights the importance of studying gender, race, and class in an interconnected framework. Inspired by feminist economist Nancy Folbry, I wish to explain and elaborate such a framework, which she has called intersectional political economics. In the next half hour or so, I will introduce this framework and hope to convince you how it can form an inspiration for economic historians. As Folbry argues, intersectional political economics can be the way forward to achieve sustainable economic development that is fair, thus directly linking to some of the central themes of this conference. I will illustrate this through the lens of care, because in the words of historian Premilla Nadasen, care is about nurturing, feeding, nursing, assisting, and loving human beings. It is the work that makes all other work possible. This triggers the labor historian in me. After all, without care work, which brings up the future labor force, nourishes the laborers, and recuperates the sick, other forms of work cannot be performed. Caring reproduces a labor force that is fit, productive, and capable of learning and creativity. Nonetheless, care is consistently underpaid and undervalued. Moreover, structural inequalities have shaped allocations of caregiving and other forms of work. This speaks to me as an economic historian. Studying the historical roots of these inequalities is particularly relevant in a political climate in which care for other human beings, as well as for the planet, seems to have fallen prey to increasing individualism and exclusion. I will furthermore argue that an intersectional perspective also exposes the colonial characteristics of the current day organization of capitalist production and care work. Thus, intersectional theory not only studies the underlying mechanisms of inequality within, but also between societies. The term intersectionality was first coined by the American scholar of law, Kimberly Crenshaw. She found that black women workers who filed court cases against their employers for discrimination saw their cases fall through exactly because they were black as well as female. For instance, one woman lost her lawsuit because she insisted that a small number of black women were underpaid, for which she had collected proof. However, the judge found her statistical material to be too scant to prove that there was sex discrimination across the board. Crenshaw argued that these women's, and I quote, intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism. Thus, black women, according to Crenshaw, are subordinated in ways that non-intersectional analysis cannot capture. She claimed that most feminists concerned with discrimination against women frame this along the experiences of white women, whereas the anti-racist movement focuses mainly on black men's experiences of discrimination. Both movements can thus not adequately address the specific disadvantages of black women. The basic idea of intersectionality is that gender inequalities coexist and co-develop with other inequalities. It relates various aspects of people's identity to their position of power, and thus to their opportunities in specific contexts. For instance, in my childhood, within a strict Christian community with working-class grandparents, I was indeed subjected to sexism, ageism, and classism. However, because I'm also white, living in a rich country, and did not suffer of mental or physical disability, I was privileged enough to get a good education and build a career, even if the percentage of female full professors in the Netherlands is still only around 30%. Patriarchy literally means rule of the father. It plays out at the level of the household, but also broader in communities, workplaces, and societies. Patriarchy is a system that not only affects relationships between the sexes and the generations, but has historically also applied to race and nationality. Think, for example, of the patriarchal power that plantation owners had over their enslaved. This is painfully illustrated by the following testimony of a US planter in 1853, who claimed, "All living on the plantation, whether colored or not, are members of the same family and to be treated as such. The servants are distinctly informed that they have to work and obey my laws or suffer the penalty." In this abusive patriarchal system, black women often experienced cumulative violence, both by white men and women, and sometimes additionally by enslaved black men. Intersections can also result in conflicting inequalities. For instance, Aditi Dixit and I have recently shown for the Indian textile industry in the 1930s that while all Indian laborers were paid low wages, there were distinct variations, not only between men and women, but also among men. Depending on caste, ethnicity, and class, some men could gain a reasonable living, while others never even earned enough to be able to start a family. Although intersectional inequalities are more commonly identified by sociologists and social and cultural historians, economic historians too need to address them, because such inequalities usually have an underlying economic rationale, as well as economic consequences. Also, they form part and parcel of the capitalist system, even though many of these inequalities, particularly those based on gender and race, predate modern capitalism. Once established, differences in institutional power are difficult to change, resulting in path dependence. In their book, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, Raj Patel and Jason Moore highlight care as one of the cheap things that capitalists since the 16th century have exploited. They did so by devaluing the worth of care through gender and race discrimination. As I will explain, capitalist institutions create powerful incentives to maximize short-run profits by exploiting unpaid or underpaid forms of surplus value. And care is a very important example of this, but the natural environment can be considered as another prominent one. Intersectional political economics draws from both neoclassical economics and from Marxian theory, but also from new institutional economics. However, it also finds faults with all of these models. Neoclassical economic models can be useful for sketching cooperation dilemmas, but they tend to be based on rational choice theory, according to which individuals are egocentric agents trying to optimize their gains. These models usually neglect the power relations and constraints under which individuals make self-interested choices. Interestingly, an exception is made for the household, which, according to scholars such as Gary Becker, is the only locus in which members display altruism. However, as many feminist economists have shown, power relations within the family, in combination with implicit social norms, to a great extent influence the choices by which the individual household members make. For instance, as Sarah Horrell, Jane Humphreys, and many other historians, including myself, have shown for many periods in history, their domestic and caregiving tasks at home very much determines women's opportunities in the paid labor market. This was rather a result from patriarchal relations than from married women's own personal choices. The options for unmarried women were generally much larger, but they too suffered from labor market segmentation. Marxian scholars do pay a lot of attention to power relations. Their models are useful for understanding why exploitative institutions persist. Once established, institutions helping one group to seize or generate a surplus that works to their advantage, though the gains are unequally distributed, often remain resistant to change, even when they become costly for everyone. However, Marxists have tended to analyze these as binary oppositions. For instance, global north versus global south, capitalists versus workers, men versus women. This disregards the many different interests that lower class women can have from lower class men, black women from white women, or migrant professors from migrant domestic workers. My research has shown, for instance, that when the Dutch government in 1889 implemented labor legislation to prohibit all night work for women working class women in the Netherlands, they did not apply this to their colonies in the Dutch East Indies. They justified this by claiming that indigenous women were inclined and used to hard physical labor. The actual motivation underlying this choice was economic. The immense shortage of cheap labor on the profitable tea and tobacco plantations on Java and Sumatra. Because of racist prejudices, the state was willing to support capitalist employers in the colony while increasingly protecting labor in the metropole. Finally, intersectional political economics draws from new institutional economic theory. Comparable to institutionalist economics, economists such as North, Wallace and Weingast, or Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson, it argues that inclusive institutions are much more likely to generate economic development than extractive ones. However, institutional economics tends to focus on political institutions and pay less attention to other sides where extraction may take place, such as the capitalist firm, the patriarchal family, or the racist community. Intersectional political economics instead intends to include these levels of analysis, as they are often the places in which unequal bargaining power provides some people with claims to the services of others without appropriate compensation. This is the colonial household signifying that. Thus, broadening the analysis of inequalities, intersectional political economics also looks at the household as the primary unit in which people make decisions about the allocation of tasks, paid and unpaid, including care work. This means that the model includes the economic role not only of production, but also of reproduction. So far, I've mostly sketched a theoretical framework. But how do we do intersectional political economics? And more pertinently, how do we apply it to our historical work? In the rest of this talk, I will provide some examples from other people's as well as my own research. I will do so along 3 thematic lines, which all involve the historical analysis of work as well as caregiving tasks. First, the interconnections between production and reproduction. Second, work and care under colonialism. And third, integrating the family and the welfare state. First, production and social reproduction. We all seem to have a pretty good idea what production entails, but probably less so with what social reproduction stands for. Amartya Sen wrote in 1997, "Human beings are not merely means of production, even though they excel in that capacity, but also the end of the exercise." What he means is that people are the result of human procreation, pregnancy, care, upbringing, and education by parents and other caregivers who socialize them into becoming participating members of society. Most of the tasks just mentioned pertain to the domain of social reproduction. To describe it a bit more plastically, social reproduction is the production of other people. Not just bodies, but also embodied physical, cognitive, emotional, and social capabilities. Adam Smith already made a distinction between productive and unproductive labor, placing domestic and care work, mostly done by women, into the latter category. Karl Marx, too, labeled the housework of women as non-productive. At best, women's household tasks served the reproduction of the laboring classes, both in terms of replenishing laborers' energy for a new workday, and in terms of breeding and upbringing the new generation of workers. An illustration of how productive and reproductive work were combined during the 19th century industrialization can be seen in this photograph, which shows a nursery for babies in a French factory. Laboring mothers placed their infants under the care of other women, close enough so they could breastfeed them, while making long working days and contributing to the family income. Early Marxian scholars and labor unionists fiercely opposed the ways in which capitalists, in their view, exploited the productive and reproductive efforts of working class women. They used it as an argument to advocate for higher workers for men, to enable the male breadwinner to take care of their families. But besides this, Marxists hardly saw the intrinsic value of reproductive work. Ultimately, the idea of separate spheres in which men worked outdoors and women stayed at home, making a clean and cozy environment for their family, thus suited both the middle-class bourgeoisie and the labor unions. It has to be noted, though, that this is very much an image of the early 20th century global north, and within this hemisphere, predominantly the domain of white women. Most women in the global south, as well as women of color in the global north, have throughout history never experienced a clear separation between production and social reproduction. They worked and still work in plantations, factories, and as caretakers in middle-class people's homes, while also having to take care for their own children and the household chores. Since the 1960s, feminist scholars have increasingly advocated that those forms of reproductive labor by women be recognized, both academically and politically. It has been fiercely debated to what extent reproductive labor should rather be seen as productive labor, and opinions continue to differ also among feminist scholars. This was all in the context of an emerging welfare state, in which people looked to the government to take some of the social, reproductive, and care tasks as their responsibility, such as healthcare provision and elderly care. In this vein, debates emerge whether a wage for housework would be favorable for women's emancipation or not. Ultimately, as Nancy Folbury has concluded, it seems that, at least in the global north, reallocating domestic and care tasks between men and women on the household level has proven more effective than rewarding them socially. Nevertheless, she goes on to argue, family responsibilities today, and I quote, have only partly been degendered, as I also showed you earlier in this graph. Moreover, in paid care work, ranging from nurses to domestic workers, salaries and wages remain relatively low everywhere. Since ancient time and across the globe, most households from the higher strata of society outsourced their domestic work, such as cleaning, laundering, and childcare, to servants. These servants worked within a wide variety of labor relations, as enslaved, live-in servants, paid in kind, or wage workers. Also, they were usually from a different social and ethnic background than the households employing them. This continues in our contemporary society, as many affluent households worldwide, often very rich and/or dual-earning couples with children, hire live-in nannies, usually from regions in the global south. This system has been called the global care chain because the childminders often leave their own children behind in their country of origin, where grandmothers or other relatives or neighbors step in to take care of these children, voluntarily or paid. On a large scale, household and caregiving tasks such as cleaning, cooking and nursing in the global north, as well as in the BRICS countries and the Gulf states, are often outsourced to migrant laborers of a different ethnic background than the receiving household. So how can we as economic historians change how we do research to include important insights on paid and unpaid care work in our analysis? A good example is the recent paper by Jane Humphreys in the Economic History Review, in which she calculates maintenance costs of individuals over the 13th to the 19th centuries. Humphreys suggests that Robert Allen's respectability baskets should be adjusted for the often unseen costs of preparing food, doing laundry, and keeping house. She argues that the criteria for respectability in terms of consumption and cleanliness changed over time, cut into families' budgets, and indicates the enormous remunerated as well as unremunerated contributions that women provided to the economy in the past. Another example is quantifying work activities by analyzing archival material, for instance, court records, based on verbs that contemporaries used to describe what people did. Inspired by Sheila Ogilvy's work on the German region of Württemberg, Maria Agren of Uppsala University has developed the verb-oriented method in which she and her team of the Gender and Work Project categorize work in early modern Sweden based on the verbs in historical text, and care is high in their tables. Finally, pioneering studies on the broader beneficial effects of reproductive tasks are worth mentioning. Think, for instance, of the work by Valerie Arti and Eric Snyder, who have studied the effects of breastfeeding for children's health in London around 1900. The groundbreaking work by these economic historians leads to more comprehensive conceptions of work, including paid and unpaid care tasks, as well as to a greater emphasis on the benefits of social reproduction for well-being broader in the past. This results in more accurate historical analysis of women's and men's contributions to the economy at large. Such analysis, however, usually look at the intersections between gender and class, but often do not take the intersections with ethnicity into account. Also, they very much apply to the economic history of the global north, where the source material as well as the research funding for historical studies are more abundant. Outside the field of economic history, historians of race and empire have in recent years paid increasing attention to the experiences of women and men in the global south. However, their work usually concerns social and cultural analysis, while more economic studies have yet to be done. And this brings me to my second thematic interest: colonialism and care. From its beginnings, domestic and caregiving labor were crucial to the imperial project. In most colonial endeavors, ranging from Latin America to Southeast Asia, but also in Africa, domestic workers were vital to the settlement of white colonizers. In many ways, employing indigenous and migrant domestic and care workers in colonial households confirmed the ideology as well as the practices of their superior status. Simultaneously, local servants were often vital for the survival of white settler families in the tropics. For instance, in terms of food preparation or curing tropical diseases. As one European settler in colonial Singapore desperately noted about her reliance on their Chinese domestic workers, you are at the mercy of these servants. Thus, from the first colonial encounters, power relations played out at the micro level of the household, exposing the multi-layered dependencies between colonizers and the colonized. Gender, as well as race and ethnicity, defined the tense and tender ties within the colonial household, both in their violent and in their more gentle expressions. In most cases, colonial settlement involved distinctive gendered patterns of migration, especially in the first centuries. Pioneers, missionaries, sailors, and soldiers were usually white men, who were not only in need of people to perform the domestic tasks that they as boys had generally not learned at home, but also often felt the desire to engage in sexual relations. Many domestic servants, whether free or enslaved, combined these personal services either voluntarily or because they were forced. The mixed-race children that followed from these relationships further complicated hierarchies within the colonial order. Gender and ethnicity also affected the choices made when employing domestic workers. In much of colonial Africa, white European households employed black men to cook, clean, wash, and serve. Advocates of male domestic workers praised them for their ability to perform heavy manual labor that neither a female domestic servant nor the mistress of the house could do equally well. From their own perspectives, migrant and indigenous men often preferred domestic work over even harder physical labor, as was, for instance, the case in the South African mining regions. And in the mid-19th century, west of the United States, the unwillingness of white women to work as domestic servants in frontier settlements and developing cities led to an increasing recruitment of male Chinese domestic workers. Colonizers consciously utilized gender to designate African or Asian domestic workers as others. Not only were stereotypical European gender roles reversed simply by employing many men for domestic tasks. What is more, white men and women called them houseboys, or falsely depicted them as feminized or asexual eunuchs, as in the case of many male Chinese domestic workers in the Pacific. Simultaneously, there were anxieties of colored men in these positions. For instance, some Americans believed that Chinese men would only pretend to be sexually disinterested so they could, as domestic servants, gain intimate access to white women's bodies. In all of these cases, the masculinity of the African and Asian domestic workers was implicitly and explicitly questioned, while at the same time their virility and strength were employed for heavy tasks as well as feared by white settlers. On the other hand, non-white female domestic workers often experienced gendered and racialized stereotyping of their femininity. As Sabrina Marchetti has shown in her study Black Girls, Italian colonizers typified colonial Eritrean domestic servants as black Venuses, who would have displayed both female servility and sexual availability. Marchetti discovered that these gendered and racialized stereotypes still resonate in Italy today, both among employers of domestic workers from Eritrea and in these female migrants' self-image. Such enduring stereotypes, especially in combination with precarious migrant status, also serve an economic function. They reinforce power relations within the household to minimize the bargaining power of domestic workers and keep their wages low. And this is only one of the many examples that show how in the post-colonial global north, colonial representations of power and subordination are still being reproduced and internalized. It is precisely such post-colonial legacies of care and coercion that my new research project beginning in September will study. Over the next 5 years, our team will investigate overt and more latent forms of violence in households in relation to domestic and care work in the former Dutch colonies of Suriname, Indonesia, and South Africa, from the 18th century to the present. We will also study the post-colonial legacies of these relationships within the current Dutch welfare state. And this brings me to the final theme of my lecture, the family and the welfare state. Historically, the bulk of the domestic and caregiving tasks have been provided for at the level of the household, but since the late 19th century, the state has increasingly stepped in many countries. For sure, older safety nets such as local communities or guilds existed before. But the welfare states that developed in the 20th century were the first to effectively provide public health care and social insurance on a large scale, when family and community ties loosened and markets could not solve the problems surrounding social provisions. Neoliberal scholars, my predecessors also mentioned it, and politicians are generally critical about social spending. They see it as a drag on economic growth and argue that progressive taxes form a threat of efficiency, even if this means that inequality deepens. However, as Peter Lindert has shown in his seminal book, Growing Public, cross-country analysis deliver a strong positive correlation between social spending and GDP growth. The social and economic inequalities that have risen again since the late 1970s are well documented. While perhaps not being the only explanation, economic historians such as Thomas Piketty have pointed to a clear relationship with neoliberal policies and the decline of the welfare state. In his latest work, Piketty, who is greatly in favor of progressive taxes, does note that the redistributed effects of the welfare state have been much more beneficial to the middle classes than to the bottom 50% of society. Considered from an intersectional economics viewpoint, the bottom half of society is precisely where single women, people of color, and migrants are overrepresented. This exemplifies how, even within a redistributive welfare state, institutionalized inequalities can be sticky and resistant to change. At the same time, most countries in the global south have even been unable to establish effective welfare state. On the one hand, this relates to their relative poverty, much of which results from colonial legacies upon independence. On the other hand, many states, including Indonesia and India, do have public social protection policies in place, but these only relate to the formal sector occupation, whereas the majority of the population works in the informal sector. For a country such as India, this means that men, the upper castes, and the middle class who predominate in formal employment are often the best off as recipients of public provisions. But even more effective welfare states in the global north, in a way, have undermined their own success. Over the past decades, issues of affordability, as well as solidarity within the welfare state have increasingly led to tensions. These tensions often have a racist, nationalist, and gendered nature. So, while multinationals relatively quietly move their capital from one country to another to avoid taxation or to move their production to cheap labor regions, debates on the global movement of people and the claims they might make to national welfare provisions are raging. At the same time, many global North welfare states are experiencing a crisis of care, with a declining and aging population and too few people able or willing to work in the care sector. The COVID pandemic has recently shown the fragility of our care system, both in the public sector and in private families' homes, where mothers were more often responsible for the care and homeschooling of children. Many populist politicians, but also more moderate ones, often backed up by powerful companies, make blatant use of this xenophobic and racist undercurrents that guide most voters' anxieties about the decline, as well as the unbearable costs of the welfare state. They use rhetoric that makes people believe that they should provide for themselves instead of for the other, and call for a smaller and leaner government. I will conclude. This brings me back to where I started my talk. Especially in times when hyper-masculine autocratic rules are on the rise, who have an interest in dividing different minority groups over issues of gender, class, and race, it is important to use our historical knowledge to get the facts right. Many of the problems we are facing, such as inequalities caused by globalization, environmental degradation, and the crisis of care, are too complex and too widespread to be solved at an individual or even a national level. If we have a sufficient eye for the persistence of inequalities within our current institutions and how they result from a multitude of intersected mechanisms based on gender, race, and class, we can perhaps try to mobilize common ground for what binds us. We are all human beings in search of a healthy, peaceful, and happy life, and thus in need of care. But this requires overcoming cooperation problems emerging from differences that on the surface divide mankind, leading to categorizing people as them versus us. In order to achieve more sustainable economic development that includes all people and safeguards our planet, we need to strive for more equitable distribution of well-being. Being aware of intersectionality helps us to having a better understanding of the complexities and contradictions of interests that reproduce inequalities. It also points us to the post-colonial continuities in those unequal power relations. In order to loosen the ties between capital, power, and politics, we need to forge intersectional coalitions that strive for more equitable redistributions. For instance, via progressive taxation and proven sustainable investments in welfare states. This perhaps sounds like a distant dream, and as historians we know that such a world is as yet unprecedented. At the same time, perhaps better than any other field, we also understand change and what brings it about. This leaves me with only one more thing to say. Enjoy the conference, everybody, and take care.
Thank you so much, Elise, for an extremely inspiring keynote. So now we still have about 7 minutes for the questions. So if you have questions for Elise, you can raise your hand and we will have members of our teams who will come to you with a microphone. So yeah, so just raise your hand and the team members are in the back. Okay, so maybe I can start with the questions. So I mean, I think it was extremely inspiring and seeing how you managed to connect all these different themes together, and especially in the challenging times that we are living today. I think, I mean, it's really onto the point to what we need to better understand. And I was wondering about, like, what do you think could be done not just in terms of research, but as well in terms of policies. Like, is there any directions that you think politicians should go, or we as researchers, what should we further study?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Well, as Mats also said, it is, of course, all starts with freedom of academic work, and I think we, as a first thing, we should not feel intimidated by, you know, politicians trying to steer us in a direction or trying to blackmail us to study specific topics. Otherwise, you're out. But at the same time, of course, also our precarity in that sense has risen. So I also understand that people would be afraid to do so. But I would urge us not to be afraid. Yeah. And in terms of what we should research, well, I think we, as a community, we are already researching very important topics that relate to, and that is also why I refer to so many of your work and in the footnotes even more. We already do such important work to show inequalities and how they intersect, how they originate, also the colonial origins of many inequalities today. And I think we should just keep on doing that.
So
yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, so we have some questions. So in the front, so if one of our members can come with the microphone. So on the fourth row. Ah, sorry, my bad. Yes, please.
Gareth Austin, thank you so much, Elise. That was terrific. I just wanted to add a qualification, which you're probably well aware of, to your observation that the idea of separate spheres was primarily a phenomenon of the global north in the early 20th century. I mean, I think that certainly makes sense in terms of North American and European internal history. But of course, you get partly from Esther Boserup the observation that you had a similar idea in parts of Africa. And although there's a generation of literature revising Boserup's work, the case that I know best in the Kan-speaking populations of southern Ghana actually fits it extremely well. And the point was expressed annually by the senior female, let's say, chief in one part of Ashanti, in that at the most important annual festival, she would say, and this is transcribed in the 1920s, for example, she would say, looking forward to the new year, may the women have children and the men gain riches.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Gareth. No, I'm well aware of also attempts of colonizers to install such a separate spheres ideology in colonial settings, and I can also understand from the point of, you know, middle and upper class indigenous society that would be attractive to them. Yeah, for certain. But to say that practice has become general in the global south, the ideals may have been there in many colonial settings or global south settings, but the practice probably wasn't. Yeah, thanks for that addition.
So we have another question.
Yes, thank you for your inspiring speech. I would like to bring another dimension into this discussion, which is the profession and professionalism. For example, care is cheap, but medical service is not cheap.
Yep.
But doctors doing care work.
Yeah.
I think there's another dimension here.
Yep.
Can we have a doctor who might not be that expensive, but at the same time doing the good care work? I would like to know more about this from your perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, for sure. Like, doctors are expensive, more expensive than, for instance, nurses, who are also in medical care, of course. So there's already that distinction, which also has a gender and a ethnic dimension, but actually I have a PhD student in the room doing research on medical doctors in the Netherlands in the last 50 years, and she's actually finding, even within this, higher educated profession, that there's very blatant gender discrimination, also via the welfare state, actually, or via social security. So, yes, there's a degree of differentiation here, and maybe class isn't as important in the higher educated medical professions, but there are many inequalities also there. Yeah.
So we have time for one final question, and I could see a hand. Yes.
Yes, thank you for your lecture. That was indeed very inspirational. Can I ask about something you said about care work, that you said care work is undervalued? And my instinct is to say, yes, this is the point, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you're right. I'm sure you're right. But what does it mean to say that care work is undervalued? Is that an economic statement? Is it a philosophical statement? We could be here all day, but do you have a quick answer to what does it mean to say that care work is undervalued?
It means, I think, that yes, it's philosophical, but I think it's also economical, because it is so cheap, it makes so much of the rest of societal machinery function. So in that sense, maybe it should be cheap. But of course, that shouldn't mean that it's only part of the society performing that work and being undervalued and underpaid, whereas higher class, white, male population profits only from that. So that is probably what I intend to say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Elise. Thank you so much, everyone. Amazing first keynote speech. So now we will be able to have a coffee break of 30 minutes. So Matt explained you the coffee break is either in Tegners or outside of the building in the pavilion of the conference pavilion outside. But so let's thanks again, Elise, for this first keynote speech. Amazing. Thank you so much.